At nearly 70 years old, Dolph Lundgren is still mentioned as one of the most enduring action icons that Hollywood has ever produced. For over 4 decades, his name has been tied to dozens of famous action films, helping shape special eras of entertainment cinema. Audiences around the world first knew him when he played Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, a gigantic villain with a cold line that became a legend in pop culture. The movie not only achieved massive box office success, but also turned Lundgren from an unknown face into a global icon. After that, he continued to solidify his position with a series of action films like Masters of the Universe, The Punisher, Universal Soldier, and many others, helping define the Iron Warrior image of the 1980s and 1990s. Not just an actor, he has also been a director, producer, and screenwriter for many independent action films. Beyond cinema, Lundgren has stunned many people with his outstanding academic background. He once received the prestigious Fulbright Scholarship and studied chemical engineering at MIT. In martial arts, he is a black belt in Kyokushin karate and was once the European karate champion, an achievement rare for a movie star. The films bearing his name have contributed to billions of dollars in global box office revenue, and his image continues to appear in major projects like the Expendables series, where he stands alongside action legends from multiple generations. All those achievements have turned Dolph Lundgren into an enduring symbol of strength, discipline, and perseverance in the film industry. But behind those glorious victories is a story that the public rarely sees. For many years, the man who once made audiences believe he was nearly invincible had to quietly face a brutal battle within his own body. The surgeries, the painful treatments, and the long days full of anxiety became part of a life he never wanted to display in front of the cameras. The body that had been trained like a fighting machine, after more than 40 years of performing dangerous action scenes, now carries the consequences of countless injuries, aching joints, recurring old wounds, and long sleepless nights when pain spreads throughout his body. There were moments when he had to confront the silent fear that his time might be slowly running out, that the days ahead might not be as many as he once thought. But it was in those darkest moments that Dolph Lundgren's willpower shone more clearly than ever. He continued to train, continued to work, continued to appear in public with the familiar calm smile of a warrior who refused to fall. For him, the greatest battle was not on the big screen, but in the quiet months of fighting illness and pain. And it was that resilience that made his story more powerful than any role he has ever played. If the story of Dolph Lundgren's willpower moves you, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this about people who have overcome extraordinary adversity. After all the glory, the films and the Hollywood applause, Dolph Lundgren's story did not begin under stage lights or on glamorous red carpets. It began in silence, a silence that stretched through his childhood in Stockholm, Sweden, where a tall but sensitive boy grew up in a family where affection was rarely spoken aloud. Dolph's family was not poor. His father was an intelligent and disciplined engineer, a man who believed success had to be built with iron discipline and perfection. His mother was a language teacher, gentler but often silent in the face of her husband's strictness. On the surface, it was a stable middle-class family where everything seemed in its proper place. But inside that house, for the boy Dolph, something was always missing: recognition. His father was a man not used to giving praise. In Dolph's memory, the words he heard most were not "good job" or "I'm proud of you," but cold remarks, sometimes sharp as knives. If Dolph made a mistake, he heard about it immediately. If Dolph did well, silence was the only response. For a child, that silence sometimes hurt more than any scolding. There were days he remembered very clearly, those long winter afternoons in Stockholm when the light faded behind the windows, when he brought home a report card with a tiny hope that this time things would be different. But his father's gaze remained the same, evaluating, weighing, then a slight shake of the head. Sometimes the man was more direct. He called Dolph weak, a short, cold word, but enough to carve itself deep into a child's memory. At other times, his father compared him to other children, friends' sons, more outstanding students, stronger kids. Those comparisons were not always shouted, but they repeated enough for the boy Dolph to start believing he was truly never good enough, and so a quiet feeling grew inside him, the feeling of not being recognized, the feeling of always standing on the edge of a world he didn't fully belong to. At school, Dolph was a smart but quiet child. He was much taller than his classmates, but that height didn't bring him confidence. Instead, it made him feel even more out of place. Other kids seemed to know their place in the world. They had friends, jokes, carefree childhood moments. Dolph was different. He watched more than he joined in. He learned to keep his thoughts inside. He learned not to expect too much. But in that silence, something else was forming. When you grow up in an environment where recognition rarely appears, you start looking for another way to prove your worth. Dolph began to think that if intelligence wasn't enough to make his father proud, perhaps strength would do it. That thought started as a small spark, a vague sense that maybe the world respected the strong more than the sensitive, and once that thought took root, it never left. In the years that followed, when people saw Dolph Lundgren on screen, a man nearly 6 feet 6 inches tall, muscles carved like stone, the cold gaze of a warrior, they often thought he was born that way. But the truth is far more complicated and sadder. That warrior was not born. He was made bit by bit, from the silent evenings in the Stockholm house, from the repeated criticisms, from the feeling that he had to become stronger if he wanted to be seen. And it was in those years, before Hollywood knew his name, before millions of audiences worldwide remembered his face, that the boy Dolph began to believe in something that would follow him his whole life, that in a world sometimes too cold, only strength earns respect. The belief that only strength would make the world respect him didn't come to Dolph Lundgren as a sudden decision. It grew slowly over the years, quietly and persistently, until the skinny boy who once lived in the silence of the Stockholm house found a place where everything began to change. That place wasn't a classroom, and it wasn't a playground. It was a small dojo, where punches, heavy breathing, and the sound of bodies hitting the training floor echoed like a raw but real rhythm. There, Dolph first came into contact with karate, and more specifically Kyokushin, one of the harshest martial arts in the world. Unlike more performative styles, Kyokushin was a direct test of physical strength, willpower, and the ability to endure pain. Punches didn't stop before hitting the opponent. Kicks were thrown with full power, and if you were weak, the dojo would quickly let you know. Dolph's first training sessions were nothing like the glamorous fight scenes he would later perform on screen. They were long afternoons where his hands bled from repeatedly punching the heavy bag, where his wrists ached so much that he had to soak them in cold water for hours after getting home. There were days he trained until his body trembled from exhaustion. But strangely, in that pain, he found something he had never felt before: clarity. In the dojo, no one cared who his father was. No one asked about his school grades. No one compared him to other kids. All that existed was effort. If he trained more, he would get stronger. If he could endure the pain longer, he would go further. It was a simple but fair world, one the boy Dolph had never experienced in the years before. Karate gradually became his refuge. After long days at school and silent evenings at home, the dojo was the only place where he could breathe deeply and feel he belonged to something. He started training for hours every day, repeating every move until his body remembered them like instinct. His punches got faster, his kicks stronger, and gradually he was no longer the shy boy standing in the corner of the room. The instructors began to notice him, not because he talked a lot, but because he never gave up. If the drill called for 10 reps, he would do 15. If the session lasted 2 hours, he would stay longer to keep training. His willpower didn't explode like a flame. It was more like a piece of steel being melted and forged day after day. As the years passed, that persistence began to pay off. Dolph didn't just improve, he became exceptional. Local tournaments became places where he could show what he was capable of. Bigger, stronger opponents started to watch out for him. And then, while still very young, Dolph Lundgren stepped onto a bigger stage: continental-level karate tournaments. Those were brutal matches, where every punch could decide the outcome, where fighters entered the ring with near absolute focus. And there, the boy once called weak began to rewrite his story. Dolph won, not once, but many times. Eventually he became the European karate champion, a title he had never even dared to imagine before. For many people, that was a moment of glory. But for Dolph that victory carried a deeper meaning. In the moment he raised the trophy high, amid the applause and the lights of the tournament, he was still thinking about one thing: would his father be proud? Because even though he had become a true warrior in the eyes of the martial arts world, deep inside Dolph Lundgren was still the boy who once stood in the quiet house in Stockholm, still carrying the simple but persistent desire to be seen by his father, and for the first time to hear that he was strong enough. But victory on the karate mat wasn't the only path Dolph Lundgren pursued. While his body was growing stronger every day through martial arts, his mind was developing in a completely different direction. From a young age, Dolph had been a bright student, especially gifted in the natural sciences. Numbers, formulas, and chemical reactions seemed to come to him more easily than to most others. And in a family where academic achievement was seen as a measure of a person's worth, that at least brought him some quiet recognition. When he entered university in Stockholm, he chose chemical engineering, a demanding field that required logical thinking, patience, and the ability to handle pressure no less than the Kyokushin dojo. Dolph's days back then were split between two worlds. By day, the laboratory with glass beakers, chemical reactions and complex equations. By night, the martial arts gym where sweat-heavy breathing and non-stop punches filled the air. To many around him, he was a rare example, both an outstanding karate fighter and a promising science student. And then a major opportunity came. Dolph won the prestigious Fulbright Scholarship, one of the most respected academic awards in the world. For many students, that was a lifelong dream. For Dolph, it was the ticket that brought him to the United States and opened the door to one of the most prestigious academic environments on the planet, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. When he set foot on the MIT campus, he stepped into a completely different world. Long hallways filled with brilliant minds, research labs where cutting-edge scientific ideas were being tested, and conversations about physics, chemistry, and technology that most ordinary people could barely follow. On the outside, Dolph was a nearly 6'6" guy with solid muscles, looking more like an athlete than a scientist. But inside, he carried the hope that perhaps this was where he truly belonged. However, that feeling didn't last long. MIT was a gathering place for the world's sharpest minds. The students there weren't just smart, they seemed to live and breathe science. In classes and labs, Dolph began to feel again the familiar sensation from his childhood, the feeling that he wasn't good enough. There were evenings he sat alone in the library, staring at complex formulas on the board and feeling like they were slipping through his mind faster than he could grasp them. Other students discussed theories with astonishing confidence, while he sometimes just listened in silence, not because he didn't understand, but because he felt he was always a beat behind. Loneliness began to creep into his life. In Stockholm, he was the karate champion. At MIT, he was just one student in a sea of frighteningly intelligent people. Those months there made him realize something hard to accept. Even after achieving so much, the feeling of not being good enough had never truly gone away. It had just changed shape. From the dojo to the lab, from Stockholm to Boston, it was still there, quietly following him like a shadow. Dolph began to wonder whether the path of science was really his path. He could continue studying, continue researching, and perhaps one day become a scientist. But deep down, something in him remained unsatisfied. There was a part of him, the part that had once found freedom in karate punches, that felt suffocated within the walls of the laboratory. It wasn't an intellectual failure. He was smart enough to be there, but intelligence doesn't always bring a sense of belonging. And so, amid the brilliant minds of MIT, Dolph Lundgren gradually came to realize a truth that was hard to put into words. This intelligent man was still searching for a place to belong. The feeling of not belonging to that academic world gradually became clearer to Dolph Lundgren. The hallways of MIT were still filled with brilliant minds, scientific discussions stretching late into the night. But inside him, something began to change. He kept studying, kept completing his research papers, but the sense that he was living someone else's life grew stronger and stronger. And then, at what seemed like a random moment, his life took a completely different turn. a direction even he himself had never imagined. That turning point began when he met Grace Jones. At that time, Grace Jones wasn't just a singer, she was a cultural phenomenon, an icon of rebellion, personality, and avant-garde art. She moved between fashion runways, recording studios, and international artist parties like a storm. When Dolph first met Grace, he was still just a tall student with the appearance of a fighter, but it was that powerful physique that caught her attention. Not long after, Dolph began working for Grace as her bodyguard. His initial job was very simple, protecting her on trips, standing near the stage during performances, and making sure no one crossed the boundaries a star like Grace Jones needed. But what Dolph didn't expect was how quickly their relationship changed. Conversations after shows lasted longer. Trips together became more intimate, and before he realized it, the tall bodyguard had become the lover of one of the boldest artistic icons in the world at that time. For Dolph, it was a completely new world. Instead of labs and libraries, he started stepping into nightclubs, artist parties, and recording studios where music played all night long. Grace Jones was unlike anyone he had ever met. She lived freely, powerfully, and without regard for the norms society tried to impose. And it was that freedom that pulled Dolph out of the life he once thought was his destiny. Grace brought him to New York, the city that never sleeps, where everything seemed to move faster and more intensely. For a guy who grew up in the silence of Stockholm, New York was like a whirlwind of lights, music, and opportunity. There, Dolph was no longer an MIT student. He began meeting photographers, directors, fashion designers, and artists of all kinds. Grace Jones opened the door to the art world for him, introducing him to people he probably would never have met without her. And it was in those meetings that the idea of a completely different life began to take shape. People in the film industry started noticing Dolph. With his nearly 6'6" height, angular face, and body honed by karate, he looked more like a character stepped out of an action movie than a chemistry student. But the relationship with Grace Jones wasn't always smooth. Both were strong personalities. Grace was a creative storm, while Dolph was still trying to find his place in this new world. Constant travel, the pressure of fame, and differences in personality began to create cracks. There were times their relationship was full of passion and freedom, but there were also times it became tense and unpredictable, just like Grace Jones herself. For Dolph, it was a period that was both brilliant and chaotic. He stepped out of the path of science, into the world of art, and began to realize that his life was changing in ways no university textbook could have prepared him for. And though that relationship ultimately didn't last forever, it did something no one else had done. It opened the door to a new world. From Stockholm to MIT, from the lab to the clubs of New York, Dolph Lundgren's life was moving closer to a much bigger turning point. A turning point that would take him from a man searching for himself to a face the whole world would soon recognize. The doors that the relationship with Grace Jones opened brought Dolph Lundgren closer to the world of cinema, but even as he stepped into Hollywood, he was still just an unfamiliar face among thousands looking for the same opportunity. He had no significant acting experience, no name recognition, and no guarantee that a karate fighter who had studied chemical engineering at MIT would find a place in this ruthless industry. But then a role appeared, and that role didn't just change his career, it changed the way the whole world saw him. That movie was Rocky IV. When producers started looking for an actor for the character of Ivan Drago, they wanted a very specific image, a gigantic, cold, almost emotionless opponent, an icon of absolute power. Thousands of actors auditioned. But when Dolph walked into the casting room, nearly 6 feet 6 inches tall, muscles like they were carved from stone, and carrying the aura of a real fighter, many in the room knew they had found what they needed. Ivan Drago wasn't just a villain, he was a fighting machine. On screen, Drago barely showed emotion, cold eyes, short, dry lines, and power that made any opponent tremble. When the movie was released, audiences around the world were immediately struck by that image. Ivan Drago became one of the most memorable villains in action movie history. And at the same time, the name Dolph Lundgren became known globally. But behind the dramatic scenes of the film was a story few people know. During the filming of the boxing scenes, Dolph and Sylvester Stallone decided to throw real punches to make the movie more authentic. At first it was just a small experiment, but Dolph, with his real martial arts background and astonishing strength, threw a punch so hard that Stallone was hit in the chest with terrifying force. That impact wasn't like ordinary movie punches. It was a real punch, with the full power of a nearly 6'6" karate fighter. The consequences appeared quickly. After finishing the fight scene, Stallone started feeling intense pain in his chest. Not long after, he had to be hospitalized for a serious injury to his chest and heart. Doctors said the punch was so powerful that his heart slammed against his rib cage, causing a dangerous condition. For many days, Stallone had to stay in the hospital for monitoring. That story later became one of the most famous anecdotes in Hollywood history. Dolph Lundgren's punch nearly took out the movie's star in real life. When Rocky IV was released, the film became a global box office phenomenon. Audiences remembered Rocky, but they couldn't forget Ivan Drago, the cold giant with terrifying power. And for Dolph Lundgren, that was a moment of both glory and a trap, because Hollywood loved that character. They loved the image of the emotionless giant, the fearless fighting machine. But when the lights went out, and the cameras stopped rolling, the real Dolph Lundgren was completely different. He was an intelligent man who had studied at MIT, spoke multiple languages, and had a passion for science. But Hollywood didn't see that person. They saw Ivan Drago. And so, when the next acting offers started coming in, most of them were similar: villain roles, giant warriors, cold, quiet characters. Hollywood turned Dolph into an icon of terrifying strength, but at the same time boxed him into that image. In the eyes of audiences, he was the monster, the emotionless giant who stepped into the ring and made the whole world take notice. But deep inside, Dolph was still the man who once sat in the MIT library, who once sought recognition from his father, and who still hadn't fully found where he belonged. The success of Rocky IV took him to the heights of fame. But it also began a new struggle, the struggle to prove that he wasn't just a giant villain on screen, but a much more complex human being than the role that made him famous. After the massive success of Rocky IV, Dolph Lundgren's life changed almost overnight. The man who had walked into the audition room as an unknown face was now recognized by the entire world. Posters of the movie appeared in theaters everywhere, and the face of Ivan Drago, cold, gigantic, nearly unbeatable, became a pop culture icon of the 1980s. Hollywood quickly realized they had an image they could sell, and so the acting offers started pouring in. Producers wanted Dolph to play warriors. Directors wanted him to become terrifying villains. The scripts all had one thing in common: they saw in him the perfect action machine. In the years that followed, Dolph appeared in a string of major action films. One of the first projects was Masters of the Universe, where he played He-Man, a superhuman warrior with a powerful sword in hand. The film had big ambitions to turn Dolph into a true cinematic hero, a new action icon for Hollywood. For young audiences, his image with blonde hair, a muscular body, and a giant sword became a symbol of strength. Then came The Punisher, where he played Frank Castle, a man devastated by loss, and turned into a machine for punishing criminals. The character was dark, intense, and carried deep pain, something Dolph seemed to understand very well. And then Universal Soldier, where he faced off against Jean-Claude Van Damme, in one of the memorable action films of the early 1990s. Those movies solidified Dolph Lundgren's image as one of the era's major action icons. He was taller than most other actors on screen, stronger, and carried the aura of a real fighter. To audiences, he was the embodiment of pure power. But fame didn't always bring peace. On the outside, Dolph seemed to be living the Hollywood dream. He moved between sets, premieres, and media interviews. But inside, a familiar feeling began to return. The feeling that had followed him since childhood. The feeling of not fully belonging where he stood. Hollywood was a dazzling but also lonely world. Relationships often came and went quickly. People who cheered for you today could forget you tomorrow. While many saw Dolph as an invincible giant, the truth was he often felt out of place in that industry. He wasn't like many other action stars. He didn't grow up in Hollywood. He wasn't a man of lavish parties. He was someone who had once sat in a chemistry lab and spent hours training in silence in a dojo. Conversations in Hollywood sometimes made him feel like he was standing outside a circle he didn't fully understand. At parties, while other stars talked about fame and career strategies, Dolph sometimes thought about very different things: science, philosophy, or distant memories of Stockholm. But the public didn't see those thoughts. To them, he was just the warrior on screen, the man who could throw devastating punches and rise after every battle. The irony was that very image sometimes made him even lonelier, because the more famous he became, the more he was trapped in the persona Hollywood had created. Many people didn't know that Dolph Lundgren spoke multiple languages, had a science background, and often preferred reading books over attending parties. They only saw the muscles and the strength. And so, even as his career kept moving forward, a part of him still felt like he was standing between two worlds: the world of intellect he once belonged to, and the world of action that Hollywood had placed him in. The films kept coming out. New posters appeared. Audiences kept cheering for the battles on screen. But when the studio lights went out, and the noise of Hollywood quieted down, Dolph Lundgren still had to face a truth no one else could see. Fame had arrived. Success had arrived. But the feeling of belonging, the thing he had been searching for since he was a boy in Stockholm, had never truly appeared. Fame arrived, but peace never did. Fame arrived, but peace never did. And then, as the 1990s drew toward their end, something else began to happen to Dolph Lundgren, something almost every Hollywood star fears, but no one can escape. The era changed, audiences changed, and Hollywood changed with them. In the 1980s and early 1990s, action cinema was built around giant men with rock-hard muscles, films full of gunfire, hand-to-hand fights, and nearly invincible characters were once the center of the global box office. But by the late 1990s, audience tastes began to shift. Action films became faster, more tech-driven, sometimes more humorous. New faces appeared, new storytelling styles took over theaters, and gradually, the icons of the previous era started to feel that change. Dolph Lundgren kept working. He still took roles, still trained, still showed up on set with the discipline he had carried from the Kyokushin dojo. But Hollywood's big projects started to become fewer. Some films didn't achieve the box office success expected. Invitations to blockbuster projects grew rarer. Meanwhile, the film industry was developing a new market: direct-to-video releases. These films didn't get wide theatrical runs, but they had their own audience, and still brought profits to studios. And so Dolph began to move into a different phase of his career: direct-to-video movies. For many actors, that was a step backward. In the eyes of Hollywood press, it was almost a sign that a star was slowly fading from the spotlight. Articles began appearing with cold headlines. Some critics called him a fading action star. Those phrases spread through newspapers and entertainment shows. To the public, the story seemed simple. An icon of the 1980s was gradually being replaced by new faces. But for Dolph Lundgren, that period wasn't so straightforward. It was a time when he had to face a truth few in the film industry want to admit: an actor's career doesn't always go upward. There are peaks, and there are also downhill stretches. The films he took part in during that phase often had smaller budgets, less promotion, and didn't get the media attention they once did. Premieres were no longer as crowded as the years right after Rocky IV. Posters no longer appeared in every major theater. But there was one thing many people didn't understand: Dolph never stopped working. He kept making films, even began trying his hand at directing and screenwriting. While the press said his career was declining, he still showed up on set, still learned lines, still rehearsed action scenes just as he had for many years before. Because for Dolph, cinema had never been just about fame. It was work, it was discipline, it was something he had devoted his whole life to pursuing. Still, it couldn't be denied that that period brought many difficult moments. When you've once stood at the top of Hollywood, the industry's silence can become very loud. Calls from producers grew fewer, invitations to big projects became rarer, and sometimes you start to wonder if the world has forgotten you. For Dolph, it was a time for reflection. He was no longer the young man who had just stepped into Hollywood with the role of Ivan Drago. He was a man who had gone through success, gone through fame, and was now seeing another side of this industry. But if there was one thing the years in the dojo had taught him, it was perseverance. In karate, not every fight is a victory. There are times you get knocked down. There are times you have to stand back up when no one thinks you can. And so even when Hollywood seemed to start forgetting the name Dolph Lundgren, he kept moving forward. Not because he was sure the lights would come back on, but because he had never learned how to quit. The years when Hollywood seemed to gradually turn its back on Dolph Lundgren's career also coincided with a very different phase in his personal life. A phase where he tried to build something fame could never provide a family. In the 1990s, when his career was still stable enough to offer security, Dolph met Annette Kviberg, a Swedish jewelry designer. Unlike the noisy world of Hollywood, Annette brought him a familiar sense of peace, close to the Scandinavian life he had once known. Their relationship developed quickly, and not long after, they got married. The early years of their marriage seemed to be a rare time when Dolph truly felt he had a place to come home to. They built a life across multiple cities, from Europe to the United States, trying to balance work and family. 2 daughters were born one after the other, bringing him a joy no movie could ever match. For Dolph, becoming a father was a completely different experience. The man who had grown up in the silence and strict discipline of his own father now tried to be a different kind of dad, gentler, more patient, and always wanting his children to know they were loved. In the rare moments when he wasn't on set, he spent time with the family, taking the kids to school, going for walks, or simply being at home together. But the life of an action actor is rarely stable. Dolph's work required long trips, months of filming in different countries, and extended periods away from home. Meanwhile, the family needed presence, stability, and ordinary moments that Hollywood life rarely allowed. Distance began to creep into their marriage. At first, it was just longer trips than expected. Phone calls instead of shared dinners, promises that things would be different after this project. But over the years, that cycle repeated. Hollywood, with all its glamour and pressure, gradually became an invisible pull between them. Dolph still tried to balance it all, but the film world never really stopped. There were films to shoot in Europe, projects in Asia, promotional tours lasting weeks, and each time the gap between him and his family grew a little wider. For Annette, that life was far from easy. Maintaining a family when a husband is frequently absent was a challenge not everyone could overcome. Over time, those pressures built up. Arguments became more frequent, silences grew longer, and sadly sometimes even people who love each other can slowly become strangers simply because life pulls them in different directions. Nearly 2 decades passed since the day they married. The 2 daughters had grown up, life had changed, and both realized their relationship was no longer what it once was. Eventually, the difficult decision was made. Dolph Lundgren and Annette Kviberg divorced. A marriage that had lasted nearly 20 years officially came to an end. There was no major scandal, no loud headlines in the press, just a quiet truth. Sometimes even relationships built on love cannot survive the pressures of time, distance, and life under Hollywood's lights. For Dolph, it was a profound loss, because throughout all those years of searching for a place to belong, from Stockholm to MIT, from the dojo to Hollywood, he had once hoped that family would be that place. But now, once again, he had to face the familiar feeling that had followed him his whole life. The feeling that the place he called home could sometimes still slip away. After the nearly 2-decade marriage ended, Dolph Lundgren's life seemed to enter a quieter phase. Those years no longer had big headlines in the Hollywood press, no longer the noisy premieres like the peak period of the 1980s and early 1990s. He kept working, still taking roles in various film projects, but Hollywood's spotlight no longer shone directly on him as it once did. To many in the industry, Dolph Lundgren seemed to have become part of the past, an icon of the muscle-bound action movie era that Hollywood was gradually leaving behind. But sometimes in this industry, history has a strange way of coming back around. And that turning point came from a man whose fate had been tied to Dolph's for many years, Sylvester Stallone. After decades in the film business, Stallone began nurturing a special idea. He wanted to create a movie that wasn't just action, but a tribute to an entire generation of stars who had shaped action cinema in the previous century. That idea later became The Expendables. The film brought together names that audiences had grown up with, screen warriors who once dominated the box office. And in that lineup, Stallone didn't forget the man who had once put him in the hospital with a real punch many years earlier. Dolph Lundgren was invited to join the film as Gunnar Jensen, a dangerous but conflicted warrior. When the project was announced, many fans were surprised, not just because Dolph was back in a major film, but because the cast of The Expendables felt like a reunion of an entire era. Alongside Stallone was Arnold Schwarzenegger, another action icon who had dominated Hollywood for years. And there was Jason Statham, representing the new generation of action cinema. When those names appeared together on screen, the movie wasn't just a story about mercenaries. It felt like a reminder that Hollywood's warriors hadn't completely disappeared. For Dolph, The Expendables wasn't just a role, it was like a second chance. After years of working on lesser-noticed projects, he was once again appearing in a big-budget film with global media attention. On set, the atmosphere was very different from many of his previous movies. These weren't young actors trying to prove themselves. These were men who had spent decades in the film industry, who understood the price of fame, and also knew that time doesn't stand still for anyone. They laughed more, shared old stories, and sometimes simply enjoyed the moment of standing next to each other in front of the cameras again. Audiences felt it too. When The Expendables was released, the film quickly captured the attention of action fans worldwide, not just because of the intense fight scenes, but because of the nostalgic feeling of seeing familiar faces return. Dolph Lundgren, once called a fading action star by the press, was now appearing on the big screen alongside other Hollywood legends. But what made this comeback even more special was the way he portrayed his character. Gunnar Jensen wasn't a perfect fighting machine. He had cracks, mistakes, and a complicated past. And perhaps that's why Dolph could bring a depth to the role that audiences rarely saw in his earlier performances. The Expendables wasn't just an action movie. To many fans, it felt like a reminder that the old legends were still standing, still ready to fight. And for Dolph Lundgren, after years of quietly walking in the shadows of Hollywood, it was a rare moment when the stage lights turned back on, a comeback few had thought would happen. But even when the Hollywood lights shone on Dolph Lundgren's life again after the success of The Expendables, another battle, quieter, more ruthless, was beginning inside his body. It wasn't a fight on screen, no cameras, no audience, and no script guaranteeing that the hero would win in the end. In 2015, Dolph started noticing strange signs in his body. At first, they were very vague: prolonged fatigue, the feeling that his body wasn't recovering as quickly as before, and nagging pains he couldn't explain. For someone who had spent decades making action films and enduring countless injuries, pain wasn't anything unfamiliar. He thought it was just the result of age and years of grueling work, but then the doctors suggested a series of more detailed tests, and the results changed everything. In a quiet examination room, under the cold white hospital lights, the doctors told him they had found a tumor in his kidney. That was the moment time seemed to stop. Throughout his life, Dolph Lundgren had been used to facing visible opponents, fighters in the ring, actors in fight scenes, or villains in movies. But this time the enemy was inside his own body, and no punch could defeat it. The doctors quickly recommended surgery. The decision had to be made fast, because in cases like this, time is always critical. The operation was performed to remove the tumor. For many long hours on the operating table, the doctors worked meticulously to excise the affected tissue. When the surgery ended, there was a moment of hope that the battle was over. But reality wasn't that simple. After the surgery, follow-up tests brought harder news. The doctors discovered more tumors, not just one, more than one. The disease didn't disappear as everyone hoped. It was still there, quietly spreading through his body. For Dolph, that was the biggest shock of his adult life. For years he had built the image of an invincible warrior, On screen he could get up after devastating punches, fight bigger and stronger enemies. But now, he had to face a completely different truth. His own body was turning against him. The doctors began talking about the next treatments: chemotherapy, targeted drugs, medical procedures that stretched on for months, even years. Cold medical terms started becoming part of his everyday life. Every time he walked into the hospital, he knew he was stepping into a battle where the outcome was never certain. The first days of treatment were especially tough. Chemotherapy wasn't like any physical challenge he had ever faced. It wasn't the short, sharp pain of a punch or an injury on set. It was a deep, lingering exhaustion that seemed to drain energy from the inside out. There were days he felt so wiped out that just getting out of bed was a major effort. But the hardest thing wasn't always the physical pain. The hardest thing was the uncertainty. In quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, the biggest question started to appear: how much time do I have left? No one could answer exactly. Doctors could give numbers, predictions, but life rarely follows those numbers. And so Dolph had to learn to live with a new truth, that every passing day might be more precious than he ever thought. What's remarkable is that throughout that time, he didn't go public with this fight. Many fans still saw him appearing in movies, in interviews, and thought his life was continuing as normal. But behind those appearances were trips to the hospital, long treatment sessions, and difficult recovery days. Dolph Lundgren, who once played fearless warriors, now had to learn to fight in a completely different way, quietly, patiently, and one day at a time. And perhaps it was in those years that the man who grew up in the silence of Stockholm returned to that familiar silence. Not the silence of loneliness like when he was a child, but the silence of someone focusing every ounce of his will on survival. The greatest battle in Dolph Lundgren's life didn't take place in front of cameras. It happened in hospital hallways, in treatment rooms, and in long nights when he had to remind himself that tomorrow was still worth fighting for. And that was the moment when his story stopped being just the story of an action star. It became the story of a human being facing what we all fear most: the fragility of our own lives. After the first months of facing that brutal diagnosis, Dolph Lundgren began to understand that this battle wouldn't end quickly. The initial surgeries and treatments were only the beginning of a much longer journey than he had ever imagined. In follow-up checks, test results brought news no one wanted to hear. The disease hadn't completely gone away. Some tumors remained. Others appeared in new places in his body. Cancer, like a patient enemy, kept advancing in silence. Conversations with doctors grew heavier. No more simple reassurances. Instead, there were cautious explanations, complex medical terms, and long pauses between sentences. In one visit, a doctor told him something no patient wants to hear: his condition was serious, and if the disease continued progressing as it was, the time ahead might not be as much as he hoped. Those words weren't an official death sentence, but they were enough to make anyone stop and think. For a man who had spent his life projecting strength to the world, it was the moment that forced him to confront his own vulnerability. For years, Dolph Lundgren had been used to playing fearless characters. On screen he could face any enemy and still stand after the fight. But in real life, when death began to appear as a real possibility, fear was unavoidable. It wasn't dramatic fear like in the movies. It was much quieter. It appeared in the late nights when everything around grew still. It appeared in moments when he looked in the mirror and wondered how much longer his body could keep fighting. And perhaps what weighed on him most wasn't himself. It was his family. His 2 daughters had grown up during the years he worked all over the world. He had tried to be a better father than his own had been, trying to give them the warmth and support he once lacked. But when facing the possibility that his time might be cut short, he started asking questions no father wants to think about. Were his daughters ready for a world without him? Had he spent enough time with them? Would the advice, the lessons, and the memories he left behind be enough to carry them forward? Those thoughts were sometimes heavier than any physical pain, but alongside the worry for his family, there was something else that kept him from giving up easily. It was the feeling that his story wasn't finished yet. Throughout his life, Dolph Lundgren had gone through many unexpected turning points. From the silent boy in Stockholm to the European karate champion. From an MIT student to a global movie star after Rocky IV. From an action icon of the 1980s to a man Hollywood had almost forgotten, and then he came back with the Expendables. Every time life seemed to reach a dead end, he found a way to keep going. So when facing this illness, a part of him refused to accept that this would be the final chapter. There were days he felt weaker than before. The treatments kept wearing down his energy, but the willpower he had forged over years in the dojo and on set was still there. He kept treating, kept seeing doctors, kept fighting, even though this battle had no audience and no applause. In the rare moments when he shared about this period, what surprised many people wasn't pessimism, but calm. Perhaps when you've gone through enough challenges in life, you start to understand that strength isn't always about winning right away. Sometimes, strength is simply the ability to keep walking even when you don't know where the road ahead leads. And so when death stood closer than ever, Dolph Lundgren didn't turn his back on it. He looked straight at his fear, at the unanswered questions, and at the uncertain future. Because if his life had taught him one thing, it was this: even when the hardest battle appears, a true warrior will still stand firm at least for one more day. In the years when the illness made the future uncertain, when every doctor's appointment carried unanswered questions, Dolph Lundgren's life unexpectedly opened a new chapter, one he himself never thought he would have the chance to experience. After years of living in the silence of treatments and thoughts about the time left, he met Emma Krockdo. That meeting at first didn't carry the signs of a grand romantic story. Emma was much younger than Dolph, a Norwegian fitness trainer with fresh energy and a completely different outlook on life. The age gap surprised many around them. But for Dolph, Emma brought something he had been missing throughout his battle with illness: the peaceful presence of someone who truly cared. As they began spending more time together, Emma quickly understood that Dolph's life wasn't like the powerful image audiences saw on screen. Behind the body once seen as a symbol of strength was a man going through long treatments, exhausting days, and worries he rarely shared with the world. And instead of stepping back from those difficulties, Emma chose to stay. During treatment days, when Dolph faced prolonged fatigue and tense checkups, Emma was often by his side. Sometimes it was the simplest moments, sitting together in hospital waiting rooms, talking to forget the anxiety, or taking slow walks on days he felt strong enough to go out. For someone used to fighting alone, that presence meant more than any grand words of encouragement. Emma didn't see Dolph as an action icon or a Hollywood legend. She saw him as a human being, a man who had gone through so many challenges and was still trying to keep moving forward. That made a difference, Dolph felt deeply. For years he had been used to being seen through the lens of Ivan Drago, through the giant cold characters on screen. But with Emma he didn't have to play any role. He could simply be himself. Their relationship grew deeper over time. They shared ordinary days that for Dolph were sometimes more precious than Hollywood's glamorous moments: quiet meals, short trips, gentle workouts when his health allowed. Emma also helped him maintain his training discipline, something Dolph always saw as the foundation of his mental strength. But this time training wasn't about preparing for a fight scene in a movie. It was part of a bigger battle, keeping his body strong enough to keep fighting the illness. When news of their relationship started appearing in the media, many were surprised by the age difference. But for Dolph, those opinions no longer seemed to matter. After everything he had been through, from a childhood full of silence, years searching for himself, the highs and lows of Hollywood, to the fight against cancer, he understood that life is too short to live by other people's expectations. The most important thing is who stands by you when things get hardest. And Emma was there in those moments. Over time, their relationship became more than just companionship through tough days. It turned into a new source of hope, a reminder that even after so many challenges, new chapters can still begin. For Dolph Lundgren, who had stood at so many turning points that seemed like endings, love arrived at the moment he least expected it. But perhaps that's exactly why it became so special. Because sometimes, after all the battles and losses, life can still bring something unexpected, a person willing to stand by you even when the road ahead remains full of uncertainty. And as his story has proven, sometimes love doesn't arrive at the perfect time. Sometimes it arrives when you've almost convinced yourself there's no time left for miracles. Sometimes love arrives when life is almost gone. After finding a bit of peace with Emma Krockdo, Dolph Lundgren's life seemed to enter a more stable phase. But even though love brought hope, there was one truth he couldn't escape. His body had paid the price for more than 4 decades of living like a warrior on screen. Audiences used to seeing him throw powerful punches, jump from moving trucks, or charge into intense fight scenes in action movies rarely thought about what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. But for Dolph, every film left a mark. The years of making action movies had turned his body into a map of old injuries. His joints were no longer as flexible as before. The falls, hard impacts and dangerous stunts had accumulated over decades, and as age began to speak, those wounds started coming back. There were mornings he woke up with such stiffness that it took several minutes to get out of bed. There were days when sudden pain in his back or shoulders appeared without any warning. Chronic pain became a familiar part of life. It wasn't the dramatic pain like in the movies. It was nagging, persistent, like a reminder that the human body can't endure such challenges forever without paying a price. And then there was age. When he passed 60, even professional athletes have to adjust their way of living. For an action actor who had devoted his life to dangerous scenes, that change was even more obvious. But what surprised many was that Dolph Lundgren never really stopped. While many action stars of his era had retired from physically demanding roles, he kept training. Not because he wanted to prove anything to the world, but because discipline had become part of who he was long before Hollywood knew his name. Workouts still happened regularly. They weren't as intense as when he was the European karate champion, but they were enough to keep his body strong and flexible. For Dolph, training wasn't just about maintaining physical fitness, it was how he kept his spirit solid. After everything he had been through, injuries, failures, illness, continuing to move and train felt like an affirmation that his fight wasn't over yet. And what's notable is that even with a body carrying the signs of age and decades of grueling work, he kept appearing in film projects. The roles may have changed, the action scenes may not have been as reckless as before, but Dolph Lundgren still stood in front of the cameras. He still brought audiences the image of a warrior, only now that warrior no longer tried to prove his strength with the hardest punches. Instead, he proved it with endurance. Perhaps what makes Dolph Lundgren's story special isn't how strong he once was in his youth. What makes it memorable is that he still stands firm when his body is no longer perfect. After more than 40 years in the action film industry, his body has paid a very high price, but instead of seeing that as a sign of the end, he views it as proof of a life fully lived. The scars, the pain and the signs of aging aren't failures. They are traces of the battles past, and for a man like Dolph Lundgren, the most important thing isn't avoiding every wound. The most important thing is to keep walking forward, even when the body has paid the price for every step on that path. After all those years fighting illness, age, and the very limits of his own body, Dolph Lundgren's story seems to come full circle back to where it began, a battle. But if you look at his entire journey, you realize that Dolph's life was never just one single fight. It was a long chain of different battles, following one after another through each phase of his life. There were battles fought in the silence of his childhood in Stockholm, where a tall but sensitive boy had to grow up under the shadow of a strict father. There were battles in the Kyokushin dojo, where every punch and every fall taught him that true strength is forged through persistence. There were battles in the academic hallways of MIT, where he realized that intelligence could also come with a sense of isolation. And then there were the battles on Hollywood screens, where he became the cold giant Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, a role that turned him into a global icon overnight. But like every great story, glory wasn't the only chapter. After the bright lights of fame came the difficult years when Hollywood began to change. When the muscle-bound action films of the 1980s gradually gave way to new styles, there were times the press called him a fading star. There were times he had to walk through lesser-noticed projects while new faces took over the spotlight of the film industry. But if there was one thing Dolph Lundgren never did, it was give up. He kept working, kept learning, kept standing in front of the cameras even when the lights weren't as bright as before. And then, like so many strange turning points in his life, Hollywood came back to him once more through the Expendables, where action legends from multiple generations came together. It wasn't just an action movie. To many audiences, It felt like a reminder that cinema's warriors had never truly disappeared, but perhaps Dolph Lundgren's greatest battle didn't take place in the ring or in front of cameras. It took place in hospital hallways when he had to face cancer, when doctors told him things no one wants to hear, and when the future suddenly became more fragile than ever. In those moments, he was no longer the action character on screen. He was just a human being, with fear, with unanswered questions, and with worry for his family, for his 2 daughters, and for everything in life he wasn't ready to let go of. But what makes Dolph Lundgren's story so special isn't that he had to face illness. Many people around the world go through that. What makes his story memorable is how he responded to that challenge. He didn't choose silence and withdrawal from life. He kept moving forward. He kept training, kept working, and kept appearing before audiences as an affirmation that his fight wasn't over yet. In many interviews, people who worked with him often say that Dolph Lundgren isn't the type to talk about resilience. He simply lives it. Perhaps that comes from his early years, from the dojo where he learned that every time you're knocked down is just part of learning how to stand back up. And if you look back at his entire life, it's clear that Dolph Lundgren's story was never about someone who always won. It was the story of someone who was knocked down many times, but always stood back up. The boy who once felt he wasn't good enough in his father's eyes became the European karate champion. The chemistry student who once sat in the MIT library became one of the most memorable faces in action cinema. And the man who once faced cancer is still here today, still living, still working, and still inspiring those who hear his story. Perhaps that's why Dolph Lundgren's life can't be summed up just by his movies or his roles. It's a long journey of challenges, failures, and comebacks. A scientist who became a warrior, an actor who became an icon, and a human being who faced his greatest fear but still chose to keep going. When you look back at all of it, perhaps his story carries a simple but powerful message. In the world of cinema, legends are often made by spectacular victories, but in real life, legends are sometimes made in a different way. Some men become legends because they win battles. Dolph Lundgren became a legend because he never stopped fighting them. The story of Dolph Lundgren's life evokes both heartache and admiration, because behind the image of a giant warrior on screen is a man who has endured so much silent pain. From the boy who grew up in silence in Stockholm, always craving his father's recognition, to the outstanding young man who won a Fulbright scholarship and stepped into MIT, his life showed that intellect and willpower can coexist in one person. But it was when the world came to know him through the role of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV that the man began stepping into a different life, one where fame and loneliness existed side by side. The years when Hollywood turned its back, when the press called him a fading action star, or when his nearly 20-year marriage to Annette Koiberg fell apart, showed that glory cannot shield a person from very ordinary losses. And then cancer appeared, with tumors, surgeries, and long nights full of anxiety, making people realize that even the strongest have moments of fragility. Yet what makes Dolph Lundgren's story so worthy of respect is the way he faced it all. He didn't stop when Hollywood forgot him. He rose again with the Expendables. He didn't collapse when illness struck. He kept training and working, and he still opened his heart to love when he met Emma Krukdal in his hardest time. For American audiences, who always believe in the never-give-up spirit, this story reminds us that true strength isn't in never failing, but in the ability to stand back up after life knocks you down each time. Because in the end, what gives a person's life value isn't the number of battles they win, but whether they keep fighting when everything seems to be against them. If the story of Dolph Lundgren's willpower and his never-give-up journey has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel to keep discovering more inspiring stories about people who rose after the toughest battles life threw at them. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll open up a new journey, full of emotion and strength just like the story you've just witnessed.